So we'll be in Hosea chapter 4, verse 14. Just like some of the previous stuff, some of this is sort of sexual in nature, so I will try to be PG-13 about it. If that gets away from me, somebody just stop me. It doesn't really bother me to talk about it, so if I say too much, you just tell me to pump the brakes a little bit. Okay, so 4:14. So the first three chapters, like we talked about before, it talks about Hosea's family to be an allegory for God's relationship with Israel. When you get into chapter 4, like Steve talked about last week, you move more into a courtroom scene where God is making allegations against Israel. And so you kind of leave the story of Hosea's family behind, and now you're going into more direct accusations against the people. So we'll pick up in 4:14. 14 it says, I will not punish your daughters when they commit adultery, or your brides when they commit adultery. And at first it sounds like he's not going to punish them for committing a sin. And that's not really what it means. It's a compare and contrast kind of thing. So when you read the next line, it makes sense. It says, for the men themselves go apart with harlots and offer sacrifices with a ritual harlot. Therefore, people who do not understand will be trampled. So let me back up and explain what he's talking about. What he's basically saying is though what the women are doing is wrong, you can't quite blame them in a sense because their husbands are doing the same thing, okay? So if their husbands are cheating on them, you can kind of understand why they might then turn around and cheat on their husbands. And so he's actually blaming the men predominantly for what's happening. So he's saying that the men have started the sin, and then the women have followed suit with their sin. So he's not ignoring the sin of the women, he's just basically emphasizing that the males have the bigger problem here because they're the ones that started this. And so what he's talking about is, when you notice in the third and fourth lines of that verse, the first time it mentions harlots in the third line is not the same thing as the ritual harlot in the fourth line. So Jesus gave his life the first one, the first harlot is what you might call, trying to think of a good word, a street prostitute, I guess you might say, as opposed to the ritual harlot, which is line 4, which is a religious harlot at the Baal temple. Okay, so there are two different kinds of prostitutes. Not that either one of them is correct, but what he's basically saying is they're having sex with both a street prostitute, which is not a religious thing, that's just a sexual thing, as well as the religious prostitutes at the Baal temple, which has religious implications and religious adultery against God as well. So there's two different types of sins he's talking about here. And he's saying that because the men are doing that, then the women are turning around and doing something similar. But if the men had not been doing what they're doing, then the women would not have done what they are doing. So the men are more guilty in the sense that they're the ones leading this sin. And this is fairly typical. I don't want to say too much here, but it's fairly typical of any false religion. When you compare Christianity with any false religion, the false religion always has human elements to it that you can compare and contrast. And you can always see inventions of a human mind involved in the false religion. Does anywhere in Scripture talk about how you should have any kind of sexual relationship outside of marriage in a religious context? No. Okay. It always talks negatively about that. But when you look at any false religion, they almost always have some kind of sexual element mixed into it, okay? And other things, but in this particular case, we're talking about sexual relationships. And so it's always a sign of a false religion because all false religions are man-made, and they're usually male-made. And if it's a male-made false religion, there's a high probability there's going to be a sexual element to it, okay? And so that's what you're seeing here. This is a Canaanite religion, the Baal worship, that the people kind of adopted when they did not drive out all the people from the land of Israel like God had told them to. Okay, the last line there, depending on what translation you read, is going to have a lot of different takes on it. You're going to see me bounce back and forth between a couple translations tonight. I don't study out of the New King James, so when I teach out of it, I sometimes come across passages, even though I've read it before, that I'm kind of shocked because I forgot that they worded it that way. So that last line in the New King James, it says, "Therefore people who do not understand will be trampled." It's kind of hard to understand what that means from that translation, but when you look at the ESV, it says, "A people without understanding shall come to ruin." And so what it's saying is, because they don't have knowledge of God and do what God is telling them to do, they will come to ruin as a result of their sin. Now, the way the New King James says it, it's a little hard to interpret that, but that's the point that he's trying to get at. So, in verse 14, he's basically, again, addressing these sexual sins that the people are committing, and he's saying that they're doing these things because they don't have a proper knowledge of God. Because they don't have a proper knowledge of God, they're going to be punished for these sins that they're committing. Okay, so as you go into verse 15, it says, "Though you, Israel, play the harlot." And so the term Israel here probably refers to the 10 tribes. It may refer to all 12. But again, he's using this harlot imagery. And he says that they're playing the harlot, but he says, "Let not Judah offend." That's the way the New King James. The ESV says, "Let not Judah become guilty." So in other words, Israel, don't influence your brother country or sister country and drag them into your mess, is kind of what he's saying. So don't pull them into your sin. And now he's going to mention a couple of cities. It says, "Do not go up to Gilgal, nor go up to Beth Aven." There are several Gilgals in Israel, and it's not kind of hard to know which one this one is. Whereas Beth Aven is a sarcastic phrase, okay? Amos did the same thing. Hosea is doing the same thing. This is a made-up town. It's not, it's a nickname for Bethel, okay? So Bethel literally in Hebrew means house of God. Beth Awen means house of sin, okay? So he's calling Bethel, instead of the house of God, he's calling it the house of sin to mock them, okay? Why would he call the house of God the house of sin? Because Bethel is a place that they set up their false religion, okay? So they offered, this is a place that Jeroboam the first, which is the first king of Israel, he set up calf worship there, and they have always done idol worship and various things there. And so Hosea is making fun of the name of the town because it's a place where they've always done idol worship or some type of false worship. And so that's what he's talking about when he talks about those two. So it's hard to know, though, is he telling the Israelites don't go there anymore to do your false worship at these two cities? Or is he telling the people of Judah don't go up to these cities to do false worship? It's hard to know which one he's referring to. These two cities, the most likely Gilgal he's referencing, as well as Bethel, they're both kind of on the border of Judah and Israel, so it would be easy for people from Judah to go there if they chose, as well as the people from Israel. Either way, whichever one he's talking about, he's telling them they need to quit going there because in both locations, it's a location for false worship. And then he says, "Nor swear an oath saying, 'As the Lord lives.'" He's talking about don't swear using God's name. Now, in the Old Testament, you could do an oath with God's name, so that alone is not a crime. But what they would often do is swear by both God and Baal, okay? And so he's saying that, if that's what you're going to do, don't drag God into it. So he's telling them to quit swearing these oaths, incorporating the name of God as well as some false deity into their false worship. So all this is a comment or commentary against their false worship. And now he's going to compare them to a calf, or I think another translation actually may have cow, heifer, whatever. So the ESV says heifer instead of calf. Anyway, verse 16, it says, "For Israel is stubborn like a stubborn calf. Now the Lord will let them forage like a lamb in open country." This is where the New King James also goes off in a different direction than the ESV, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying it makes it a little hard possibly to understand what it's talking about. So in verse 16 in the ESV, it says, "Like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn," so that part's the same. But then the next two lines, it says, "Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in broad pasture?" So in the ESV, it's asking a question, where in the New King James, it's making a statement, okay? So what is he getting at? Probably what he's saying is, because they're so stubborn, can God actually feed them anymore, spiritually speaking, okay? So in other words, another way to say it is, are they too far gone that they will even listen to what God has to say anymore, okay? So even if God wanted to take care of them and bless them and try to bring them back, would they even listen to what God has to say? And the implication is no, they won't listen to what God has to say anymore. They're too far gone, and they're going to do what they want to do. Of course, the irony here is they think they're fine, okay? They think that what they're doing in terms of their worship to God is perfectly acceptable, and they're blinded by the fact that they're completely lost, okay? So Hosea is basically, telling them, you are too far gone, or you're on the verge of being too far gone to even come back. So verse 17, it says, "Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone." So in other words, Ephraim here, Ephraim is the largest of the 10 tribes that make up Israel. And so when Ephraim is used, it stands for the country as a whole, okay? So you could just substitute the word Israel there if you want to make it maybe sound better to you. But what he's saying is Israel or Ephraim, they have joined themselves to idols. Now the word joined it's the same word that would be like a husband is joined to their wife, or a person is joined to a particular cause, or whatever the case may be. So it means that you've associated yourself with that and dedicated yourself to that thing or person. And so in this sense, Ephraim is dedicated or joined themselves to idols, okay? So they are not dedicated or joined to God, they have joined themselves to idols. And because of that, it says, let him alone, or in other words, leave him alone, abandon him, basically, because he's made his choice, and he's going to associate with idols, not with God, okay? Now, if you don't know, the word for idols there isn't literally a word in Hebrew for idols. The word just means emptiness or vanities, okay? So if you read it that way, Ephraim has joined itself to emptiness, or worthless things, or vanities, basically things that aren't real and don't mean anything, okay? So that's what they've decided to dedicate themselves to, is worthless stuff as opposed to God. I hope as you're reading through all this, you're starting to think, wow, that sounds very familiar to our current country and situation, okay? How many people dedicate their lives to things that don't mean anything? Not only do they not mean anything, they're pointless and destructive and foolishness. And so if you ask yourself, are idols alive and well in this country, the answer is a dramatic yes, okay? They are very much alive and well. Especially when you think about what the word actually means, they are very much alive and well in our country. And so as you're reading through this, and as we get into the next chapter, start to ask yourself, if God is saying Israel is too far gone because of their sin, and just leave them alone, because they have dedicated their lives to worthless things, and they have crossed the point of no return, how do we then know in our society if a person has crossed the point of no return, and how do you know who to evangelize to and maybe who not to evangelize to, because some people you can evangelize to all day long and they're never going to turn, okay? And that's a hard question to answer, and obviously I'm not God nor are you, so we don't really know. But the big thing about evangelism, as Brian will tell you, is it's very frustrating because you hope for 100%, but you're not going to get 100%. Because you're going to get a very small fraction of people, and that was true during Hosea's time. That's true during today's time. But as our country turns more and more and more away from God, you have to ask yourself the question, if he's saying this about Israel, what would God say about the people of our country? And how do you discern which ones might actually listen and which ones will never listen to what you have to say or to what God has to say? All right, so with that in mind, we'll keep going. Verse 18, it says, their drink is rebellion. Let's see how the ESV says this. It's a little different. Yeah, so I'll read it out of the New King James, and I'll go back to the ESV. Verse 18, their drink is rebellion. They commit harlotry continually. Her rulers dearly love dishonor. The wind has wrapped her up in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. When you look at the ESV, instead of saying their drink is rebellion, the ESV says when their drink is gone, and basically implying what is happening is that they start with one sin. That sin then leads to another sin, which is worse than the first. And then that leads to another sin and so forth. So they bounce from sin to sin to sin. So when you look at that in verse 18 in the New King James, their drink is rebellion. In other words, they're rebelling against God. And then from there they jump to harlotry. So they commit harlotry continually. And then it says, her rulers dearly love dishonor. The word dishonor there, it's kind of the word you would use when you're talking about nudity, and nudity being dishonorable. And so it's kind of keeping that sexual metaphor going, that the people are committing these sexual sins, but it's because they're following their rulers, okay? So their rulers are doing this and leading the people into it, okay? So the rulers love the dishonor or themselves being in this kind of environment where they are also committing these sins with the temple prostitutes. So the leaders are doing it, therefore the people follow suit and do the same thing, okay? Verse 19, it says the wind has wrapped her up in its wings. The word wind and the word spirit is the same word in Hebrew. It's ruach, so you'd spell it like R-U-A. We don't really have an English letter for that last letter. It'd be like C-H, I guess you would say, ruach. And so it can mean wind, it can mean spirit. So the idea is like they have been caught up in this spirit of immorality, basically, is what Hosea is saying. And he's saying that eventually what will happen is, because they've been caught up in this spirit of immorality, and basically what he's saying is that they have so dedicated their lives towards immorality, that's become kind of, not a spirit in terms of an external spirit, but like it's their ideology, in other words. Their ideology has become one of immorality. So what will happen eventually is they will become ashamed of this, okay? Now, when will they become ashamed? Maybe not till Judgment Day, okay? That may be when they actually become ashamed. Maybe not in this life. But at some point, it's going to catch up to them, is what he's saying. And so they'll become ashamed of their sacrifices. Okay, so chapter 14 is a lot of accusations, chapter 4 is a lot of accusations God makes against the people for the sins that they have committed against them. Chapter 5 is going to kind of go with the same direction, okay? And we'll see how far we get into this. All right, chapter 5 is going to start off with 3 imperative verbs. An imperative means a command. So God is going to issue these 3 commands to 3 different groups of people. So he says, hear this, and he talks to the priest. Then he says, take heed, and he's talking to Israel. And then he says, give ear, house of the king. Okay, so he starts with the priests, then he kind of goes to the people in general, and then he goes to the king, who is obviously over all of the country. And the command is basically listen to what I'm about to say. The next line, for yours is the judgment. Hard to know what direction to take that. It can mean one of two things. It can mean that God is issuing a judgment against them, or it could mean that they were supposed to be, as the leaders of the country, responsible for justice. If you remember, Amos talked a lot about social justice and how the rich people were oppressing the poor. He might be saying that because you were the leaders of the country, particularly the king, and you did not promote social justice, but you promoted instead gain for yourself, if that sounds anything like some of our current politicians, then because of that you will be judged. Okay, so he's probably talking about a judgment against them. Now, why is the judgment? Is it because they failed to do social justice, or is it because of the failures that they mentioned in chapter 4? Could be a combination of all of it. Okay, so then he says, he mentions I'll start with 2, and then I'll probably tell you a third one. 2 things they have done. Sorry, my throat's really dry. He says, because you have been a snare to Mizpah and a net spread on Tabor. So these are 2 towns, and he uses hunting metaphors, so a snare and a net. So what he is saying is you rulers of Israel, particularly the king, you're supposed to have led the people in a relationship with God, but instead what you've done is you've led them essentially to hell by your actions, leading them to commit the same sins as you, and as a result you have caught them into a trap, okay? So a snare, a net, etc. And so you have led the people down this path, basically. Then verse 2 is confusing in the New King James. It says the revolters are deeply involved in slaughter. Honestly, I don't know what that means. What this may mean, the RSV and the NRSV took this a different direction. If you change one letter in 2 of the words in Hebrew, and it's a very small change, basically going from an S to a TS is one of the changes. TS is a Hebrew letter, so you're just switching letters. Then the way it could read instead, if you do that, would be, and a pit dug deep in Shittim. And so if you read it that way, it's basically the third line of that. So what you would have is, because you have become a snare to Mizpah and a net spread on Tabor and a pit dug in Shittim, okay? If that's the case, then what he is doing is just providing 3 lines to say the same thing, where he gives a hunting metaphor for a trap, a snare, a pit, etc., and then a city name, okay? That may be what it should have been. I'm not really sure. But anyway, the point is that the leaders are leading the people into sin, okay? And then in the last line of verse 2, it says, though I rebuke them all. So God is saying he rebukes them for what they have done. The word rebuke there, the ESV uses discipline instead of rebuke. It's the kind of training that a child or parent would give to a child is what the word normally means, but in the prophets often pick this word up and use it to express God disciplining or correcting his people, okay? Kind of like God's people are God's children, and he's having to train them or correct them, okay? And so that's kind of the idea that is made here. Okay, verse 3, it says, I know Ephraim. Again, Ephraim stands for the country as a whole. And it says, and Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you commit harlotry, Israel is defiled. And so what what he is getting at is God says, I know you, but obviously you don't know me, okay? And why would he say that? Because they are committing harlotry, okay? So he's saying, I know you, I know your sins, I know who you are, you're supposed to be my people, but clearly you have a false understanding of who I am as your God, okay? Because if you think that you can mix me in with Baal, and that I'm going to be okay with that, then you don't have a clue who I am, okay? And so how many people in our religious world today, even though they claim to know God, they really don't know who God is, okay? They get themselves mixed up in all sorts of things of the world or false teachings or whatever the case is. And so would God say to them, I know you, but you don't have a clue who I am. Often people get a picture of God that they have made up in their own mind, okay? They think God is this when God is really that, okay? And so what Israel is doing is Israel is mixing religions, okay? They're taking a bit of the Canaanite religion and Baal worship. Why? Because there are elements of it that are appealing to people, okay? And they're mixing that with God, and they're basically putting God and Baal on equal footing, okay? Now, obviously, we don't worship Baal today, but how many people want to straddle the line between I will worship God and I will worship myself, okay? Because what is false idol worship? An idol is just a human invention, okay? It's something the human mind created. So when you worship that thing, what you're really worshiping is the creation of a human. Therefore, you're worshiping humanity, which means you are essentially worshiping yourself, okay? So how many people in our world today say, yeah, I believe in God, but really they're worshiping themselves. They want to put God and themselves on equal footing. And they'll pick and choose the parts of God they like, and they'll pick and choose the parts of their own life that they like. And they don't really know who God is, nor do they really dedicate themselves to God, okay? And so that's what Israel is doing. Israel is playing the harlot. They want God when they want God, and they want to do what they want to do when they want to do it. And so that's, there in turn, is the problem. Okay, so he's saying, I know you, but you don't know me. He says, you commit harlotry, and then he says Israel is defiled. And the word for defiled there, it usually it's in reference, or it can be in reference to sexual, defiling yourself sexually, okay? And that's what the people are doing. They're committing this harlotry with the Baal prostitutes and so forth. And so as a result of that, they become defiled because of their sexual sins. Okay, verse 4. They do not direct their deeds toward turning to their God, for the spirit of harlotry is in their midst, and they do not know the Lord. Again, it says they do not direct their deeds toward turning to God. So in other words, repenting and going back to God is not their priority, all right? They are so far down the path of doing what they want to do that the idea even of repenting is foreign to them, okay? That is not something even that they even think about. And why is that? Line 3, for the spirit of harlotry is in their midst. And again, this is not an external spirit. This is not some demon that has come upon them to force them to do something. This just means, spirit means like their ideology, okay? Their way of thinking about things. Their way of thinking is so far gone that it's only of harlotry, and that's what they have caught themselves up in. And so it says, as a result of that, they do not know the Lord. Now, if you go back to chapter 4, God said one of the main sins and main problem of the people is they did not have a proper knowledge of God, okay? and he really condemned the priest for not teaching them the right thing. And why did the priests not teach them the right thing? Well, for two reasons. One, the priests were involved in this stuff too, and they liked being involved in it. And secondly, the priest profited off the sin of the people, okay? So if you're a priest, you got to eat the sacrifices or portions of the sacrifices the people made. So if the people sinned more, that meant more sacrifices, which meant more free food for you, right? So so they were just like, sure, go ahead and sin, and then I'll reap my reward off the back end of this. And so the priests were guilty of leading the people down the wrong path. And so when you look at religious leaders today, how many people profit off of false teaching? Okay, a lot. All right, so this is still a very common problem. All right, verse 5. Here comes the main crux of the situation. This is a courtroom language in verse 5. It says, "The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Therefore Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with them." So what is he saying? This is a courtroom allegation, and what it's saying is Israel's pride testifies against Israel before God, okay? So their pride is testifying in the court before God, and their pride is testifying against them to say that, yeah, the whole reason why they won't repent, they won't come back, they won't even acknowledge their sin is because of their pride, okay? So if you recall, Amos said something very similar, okay? Amos said God hates pride, okay? And so Hosea is basically saying the same thing. Pride is at the heart of their sin. They do not want to acknowledge that they are doing anything wrong. They do not want to change. They are very happy in their current situation. And I'm not equating the word pride to the pride movement totally, although the two are obviously related. But pride is at the heart of a lot of the sins in our country, including the pride movement. It's all bound up in worship of self as opposed to worship of God, okay? And that is the problem back then. That is still the problem today, okay? So people do not want to dedicate themselves to a deity or to God. They want to dedicate themselves to themselves, okay? And why do you want to do that? Well, because it's fun. You can do whatever you want to do, right? But what are the consequences of it? Well, hell, in the end, is the consequence of it. You can't save yourself, right? So it's fun for a little while until you end up having to account for yourself, and then it's not fun anymore. But this is all a result of pride. All right, verse 6. All right, sorry, let me back up. The word stumble there in both of those lines, it's a religious and moral stumbling, not you tripped over a pebble. So it's just a word or a euphemism for stumbling or falling in a religious or a moral sense, right? Okay, so verse 6. With their flocks and herds they shall go to seek the Lord, but they will not find him. He has withdrawn himself from them. Sorry, I'm trying not to cough. What he's talking about here is, it sounds like Israel is completely off the rails, and they are, but they don't see it. They're still worshiping God, actually technically very faithfully. They're still going, they're still offering all the sacrifices and so forth. It's just that their heart isn't in it, and they're also trying to straddle the fence between God and Baal, okay, and themselves. So they're still going to worship on Saturdays. They're still offering their sacrifices, sometimes even more than what was expected of them. And that's what he's saying here. You're still taking your flocks and your herds. You're going to seek God, but you're not going to find God because God has left the building, so to speak. He's not there anymore, and he's withdrawn himself from you because you have left him as your only Lord. Therefore, he's not going to put up with it, which is what he said in Deuteronomy, is if they went after false gods, God would abandon them, okay? And that's what God is doing. He has left because they're not going to change. All right, verse 7. They have dealt treacherously with the Lord. I think the ESV says something different. They have dealt faithlessly with the Lord. So instead of treacherously, it says faithlessly in the ESV. They have dealt treacherously with the Lord, meaning they have not treated God fairly. They have abandoned him as their sole God. And then it says, for they have begotten pagan children. The ESV says they have borne alien children. It's talking about, you've been having sex with the Baal prostitutes, and as a result of that, you have had illegitimate children, okay? So you have created these illegitimate children as a result of your false sexual religious practices. And then it says, now a new moon shall devour them in their heritage. ESV says, now the new moon shall devour them with their fields. A little bit different. What he's talking about here, they would have a festival every month for the new moon in Israel or in Jewish religion. This was just sort of celebration thing. It was supposed to be a time of happiness, a celebration for the new moon. And he's saying that that's not going to be a happy time anymore because I've abandoned you. And if you remember in the context of what's happening, we're in that last 30-year time frame of Israel. Things are unraveling. They have political instability. They're having a bunch of kings assassinated over and over. Assyria is threatening and about to take them over. And God is saying, you used to celebrate these new moons, and that was a lot of fun, but that's all coming to an end because Assyria is on the doorstep, and I am not going to protect you from them. It would be like us saying, 4th of July is fun, but this time next year, your country won't be here, so you won't get to enjoy it anymore. It's kind of the same thing. All right, verse 8, it says, he's going to mention 3 different ways of making an announcement, basically. He says, blow the ram's horn in Gibeah. That's obviously a ram or cow's horn. In Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah, cry aloud at Beth Aven. Now remember, Beth Aven is a sarcastic phrase for Bethel. So these are 3 different cities. He's listing them from, I think it's south to north. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They're going in a certain direction. They're all pretty close to each other, and they're all technically supposed to be in Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. But they have switched hands multiple times between Israel and Judah based on the fighting between the 2 countries. And then I'll explain why that's relevant in a second. It says, look behind you, O Benjamin. The ESV says something quite different. It may be the war cry for Benjamin. In other words, it's Benjamin's war cry that he's referencing here. Verse 9, it says, Ephraim shall be desolate in the day of rebuke. Among the tribes of Israel I make known what is sure. In other words, God will make the truth become relevant, or known, I should say, over time. And Ephraim is going to be taken over. In other words, Israel is going to fall in time. Verse 10, the princes of Judah are like those who remove a landmark. I will pour out my wrath on them like water. So Judah is not innocent here, and Judah is obviously going to fall later. So this goes back, this connects verses 8 and 10. So Gibeah, Ramah, and Bethel are cities that should be in Benjamin, but they change hands between Israel and Judah based on war. And what he's referencing in verse 10, when he says the princes of Judah are like those who remove a landmark. So what he's saying is God is the one who approved the allotment for the 12 tribes. Okay, so Benjamin originally had an allotment that they were supposed to have, and these cities should have fallen into that land. But Israel took those cities, and then Judah took them back, and so forth. Well, what he's referencing is one of the particular times when Judah, the king of Judah, I think it was Asa maybe, but I'd have to go back and check, takes these cities back as well as additional land. And what he's saying is you don't have any right, Judah, to take land from Israel or vice versa. God is the one who approved those allotments. So Judah can't go into, say, Ephraim and steal land from them. That's God gave that land to Ephraim. Okay, so you're stealing what God originally designated. And so Judah's guilty of this stuff, as well as Israel. They both did the same thing. So that's what he's referencing here between those two verses. So verse 11, Ephraim is oppressed and broken in judgment because he willingly walked by human precept. I think ESV says he determined to go after filth, is what it said there. Probably what he's referencing is, so these last 30 years, you got a lot of political instability, and what's happening is Israel reaches out to different countries to help, and they make a pact with Syria, or Damascus is the main country in Syria, still is the main country in Syria. They make a pact with the king there to fight against Judah, and so you have a war called the Syro-Ephraimite War, where they decide to attack Judah, and then Judah in turn says, I can't beat those two together, so hey, let me appeal to Assyria. And so Assyria comes in at Judah's request, and they knock off Syria. So Assyria beats Syria. And that really weakens Syria. It also weakens Israel. So as a result, Israel ends up saying, we're in trouble. So Israel makes a pact with Assyria and becomes a vassal country of theirs. And that's the beginning, or that's basically the end. Their last king kind of revolts, and Assyria says, we're done, and comes in and takes them over. But anyway, as a result of these political alliances, it brings Assyria into the fold. Assyria knocks off Syria, and then knocks off Israel. And then Judah is left, even though they asked them to come in to help, they become a vassal country too to Assyria. And so they're all giving money to Assyria to try to prevent them from being destroyed. And so Syria, Damascus, Syria, is not destroyed, but Israel is, and then Judah becomes a vassal king. So what he's referring to is these, instead of trusting in God, you're making these political alliances with these other countries, which God told them never to do, okay? God is supposed to be your leader. You're supposed to trust in God. You don't go chasing after these other countries. I know the bell rang, so I'll just make one last point. So what the people are doing, they're sinning by false worship with the Baals and all the stuff that goes along with the Baals. They're also sinning by making false or these alliances with these other countries. So both show a complete lack of trust and understanding of who God is. Okay, so that's really the problem with the people. The people have a pride problem, and they don't know who God is because they don't have a proper knowledge of God. Okay, does anybody have any questions? All right. Good to be back. Good to see everybody. Have a good week.